If you are old enough to even remember, chances are you have some faint, maybe even vivid memories of seeing this little guy on the side of your computer screen, particularly when using Microsoft Word. You may have come across him in school during computer class, or even just using the computer at home recreationally. The fact is, he was everywhere, and you could not escape him. His name? Microsoft Clippit, commonly referred to as Clippy, and he was seen as the answer to all of Microsoft's problems at the time of its introduction in 1997. Many people were still getting used to the idea of computers, viewing them more as complicated, intimidating machines rather than convenient, user-friendly tools. And Clippy was Microsoft's attempt at putting an adorable face to this rapidly growing, relatively new technology. It changed people's perceptions, all right, but not in the way Microsoft was hoping. Rather than seeing Clippy as this warm, welcoming, helpful addition to the Windows experience, many people just found him very annoying, distracting, and felt that he complicated things even further than before. When trying to do basic tasks such as writing a paper, Clippy would often just get in the way, asking bubble-headed questions or providing irrelevant advice that would ultimately just hinder the productivity of the user. Microsoft's sole mission of trying to facilitate the use of their products ended up completely backfiring in their face, even in some extreme cases, turning people off from Windows altogether. When we look at the strange tale of Clippy in retrospect, it is quite apparent that it was destined to fail from the very beginning. And this all had to do with Microsoft's deep disconnect with their audience, their untimely vision, and just their overall poor execution of the product. But was, or even is there, any way of saving Clippy? Well, that's where the untimely vision part of all this comes into play. Perhaps Clippy wasn't this catastrophic failure on Microsoft's end, but simply a product too ahead of its time. Maybe it was the people who were the problem, not Clippy. Maybe Microsoft was trying to solve a problem that just didn't exist yet. And just maybe, people needed more time to understand the capabilities and workings of the personal computer. Today, we take a look at the conception and development of what would arguably become Microsoft's strangest product, and how it would accidentally shape the way for creating assistant technology that we take for granted today. So right now, I am on White Oak Avenue in Granada Hills, California. I grew up in this area, but chances are you have seen it before. This also happens to be the exact spot where the flying scene was filmed in E.T. It was a little weird showing up to a neighborhood and pulling out my camera, so I tried my best not to look suspicious.
No, lady, I don't want your drugs.
But Steven Spielberg was able to work his way into becoming one of the greatest directors in movie history. And you too can become a filmmaker thanks to Storyblocks. As you know, stock footage is expensive, reaching as high as $500 for just a 10-second clip. But Storyblocks is a subscription-based service that provides unlimited downloads of professionally made clips of just about anything, completely royalty-free. Once you download it, you can use it forever, with no restrictions on where you can distribute your film projects. Storyblocks doesn't just offer video, they also have music, sound effects, images, and even pre-made motion graphics templates, all available to download at ease. One of my favorite things about Storyblocks is their plugin for Adobe Creative Cloud. I can search for anything I want all within my video editor. I don't even have to go searching on the internet for it. Then I can just download it, and it automatically adds itself to my project. Very convenient. I use Storyblocks all the time. I'm even using it on this video right now, and now you can use it as well. By visiting my link on the screen, you can create a Storyblocks account at one set price and get access to unlimited stock media downloads. So go ahead and get started with Storyblocks and make your dreams a reality. Now, before we get into Clippy, we need to provide quite a bit of preamble, background on how such an idea would even come about in the first place. So get comfortable, this is gonna be a minute. Our story begins way back, specifically on January 24th, 1984. What's so special about this date? Well, it was the day that Apple released the very first Macintosh. The personal computer was now even more personal. Although by no means the first of its kind, the Macintosh took technologies that were quite underground and made them mainstream. To a lesser extent, text-to-speech.
Hello, I am Macintosh.
And to a much greater extent, the graphical user interface, also known as GUI. You could now perform what, at the time, was considered the most sophisticated of tasks with just the click of a button. You no longer exclusively needed some difficult command line. By adding a voice and a unique look to this computer, the Macintosh now had a personality. It further taught the industry that computers do not have to be these utilitarian, glorified calculators. They could be incredibly handy tools that are warm, welcoming, and speak the same language as a human being. Now, of course, the Macintosh was not immune to having several problems of its own. But computers going forward would follow suit and take great inspiration from it, including the competition. Computers were now easier to use than ever before. But how can we make them even easier? Well, just a year after the Macintosh, a new operating system would be released, one which Steve Jobs alleged completely stole from Apple. It was called Microsoft Windows, and the fact it was compatible on a wide range of machines made it much more accessible than a $2,500 Macintosh. So naturally, Microsoft's influence in the software realm grew, and they would become huge by the mid-1990s, especially with their release of Windows 95. With practically the entire computing world in their hands, Microsoft wanted to revolutionize the art of personal computing even further. Well, in 1996, an interesting piece of research came out of Stanford University, put together by communications professors Clifford Nass and Byron Reeves. You may recognize these names from my Bonzi Buddy video, and yes, there is quite a bit of overlap between Bonzi and Clippy. But anyway, in their findings, they concluded that people treat computers the same way they treat television, advertising, even the news. They treat them as human beings. Despite these things being inanimate objects, people would develop relationships with them, particularly within the realm of voice-based technologies. Studies even showed that people felt more welcomed and safer around computers that used female voices rather than male ones. Being human is all we know. So when we see something that is complicated, robotic, the exact opposite of human, it can be intimidating and prevent people from wanting to interact with it. This new theory would be called the media equation, and Microsoft's new mission was to use this as their blueprint for developing their products. What if Microsoft could do with the current computers what the Macintosh did with command line computers? Well, luckily, Microsoft wasn't completely oblivious to the possibility of a theory like this surfacing, as they kind of predicted it, in just all the wrong ways. About a year before the media equation was published, Microsoft Bob was released. This was a program designed for Windows 3.1, the version of Windows before 95, and it basically made the GUI experience much more personal and literal. The Macintosh was revolutionary in that it made complex code look like everyday objects that people were familiar with. Microsoft tried this to a whole other level. By making the computer look like an entire room. You click the clock on the wall to access your clock settings, things like that. And if you had questions, your assistant was there to help, whom you probably know, Rover the dog. Ugh. Just get cold in here? This wasn't a computer. This was your second home, just in the digital world. An idea like this sounds super cool and revolutionary, yet it was a complete failure. Now, there were a ton of problems with Microsoft Bob, and this venture alone should be its own separate video. But the main thing you need to take away from this case was that it grossly misunderstood its audience. It's great if you want to make your software simple, but you don't need to treat your customers like they're stupid either. This looks like a Fisher-Price toy, not a computer. Could you imagine this being taken seriously in a workplace environment, especially in the 1990s when computers looked like this? In regards to the media equation, Microsoft was unintentionally trying to follow two of its main points: the fact that people will use things the way they are represented, and people will use things that are simple. Yes, the Macintosh was familiar, but it still looked like a computer. There was a balance between the two extremes. Microsoft Bob failed to do that, and by leaving no room for interpretation, they effectively insulted the intelligence of their base. Microsoft misunderstood this first point and took this second one too far. Thankfully, with Windows 95 being a success, Microsoft realized they didn't have to overthink things. But still, Windows could be simpler, and that's when they took into account the newly published media equation. Windows should have a personality. Although Bob was ditched, Microsoft decided to keep the assistant aspect of the product known as Microsoft Actor, and just change things up a bit. Baby steps though. Instead of having this assistant on the entire operating system, let's just put him on one product, Microsoft Office, and its new feature, Office Assistant. Naturally, we need to make this character Office-themed, so they had the designer that they used for Microsoft Bob, children's illustrator Kevin Atterbury, take a crack at it. After doing some sketches, ironically on his Macintosh, Atterbury finally created his new character, and Microsoft Clippy was made. And then with the release of Office 97, Clippy was now part of the MCU, the Microsoft Cinematic Universe, ready to answer all your questions. Well, no, not really. You see, Clippy would just offer very unnecessary help, like asking if you need help writing a letter. Most people, especially on the computer, know how to write letters. Most computer users aren't children, they are adults, often in work environments. Microsoft was quite literally just repeating one of the many mistakes they did with Bob, treating their user base like they're little kids. They don't want to be talked down to. Again, they just didn't understand their audience. Although Clippy was the one that succeeded the most in focus groups and therefore was made the default assistant, Microsoft still willingly ignored one problem that seemed small but would ultimately make a huge difference. Referring back to that study regarding computers with male and female voices, in which users had a more positive experience with the female computer, Clippy had the opposite issue. Clippy was too masculine. A lot of the women in the focus groups felt uncomfortable by him, as if he was staring at them in a borderline flirtatious way. Obviously, the men running the focus group were all like, "I don't know what you're talking about," and just dismissed the feedback completely. Now, Clippy wasn't the only assistant, just the default one. You also had Shakespeare, Einstein, Hoverbot, etc. But still, masculine characters. And if we are strictly following the results of the study, it makes sense why user experience was more negative than if these characters were more diverse. But again, of course, this was just one of many problems. In addition to the overly cutesy-wootsy characters that appealed more to children than adults, the design of the technology itself was also just annoying. Clippy would often just get in the way, distracting what could otherwise be very focused people. You could always turn off Clippy in your office settings, but most people didn't know that, or even know how to do that. So he was kind of just stuck there. And sometimes Clippy just wasn't there at a good time. Say you're writing a breakup letter to your significant other. Do you really want to see him just clipping up the place? And lastly, it simply didn't help that Clippy was more or less just a personified version of Office's already existing help menu. Clippy was very pre-programmed, and it felt pre-programmed, asking the same questions over and over again and not taking users' preferences into account. It wasn't warm or personal, it was very mechanical. It was actually counterintuitive in trying to fulfill the propositions postulated by the media equation. But when you really think about all those things, is it really Clippy's fault? Was he just too ambitious for his time? Keep in mind that this was before sophisticated machine learning-based AI or web-scraping-based AI such as Siri. And make no mistake, I have an entire bone to pick with Siri, but again, its own separate video. But in many respects, Clippy just kind of came out at the wrong time, and the things that it wanted to do were limited by the technology of the 90s. But with that said, you could also take poor execution into account as well. Bringing back up BonziBuddy, the fact that it used the web for things such as looking up answers to some of the questions the user submitted gave it a bit more life and made it more useful, even if its motivations were a bit different. Although the internet was still in its infancy in 1997, Microsoft could have very well updated Clippy with these web searching capabilities as the years went by. But even then, the damage was already done, and it doesn't fix the other problems that existed with it. So by the time Office XP came around, the message was loud and clear, and Clippy was turned off by default. But don't fret, you could just turn it back on. and he also had a bit of a glow-up. But even then, Microsoft knew that they made a mistake with Clippy, putting him at the butt of many jokes. Even now, Microsoft still has a bit of fun with this, introducing little Easter eggs about him, even today. But the actual functionality of Clippy would be removed in 2007. But now there is talk of bringing him back. There are currently rumors that Clippy could return in the way that it was supposed to. Especially with Microsoft's deep investment into OpenAI, Clippy could very well become a personification of ChatGPT, effectively changing it from the worst AI tool in history to the best one in history, even outbidding Cortana. And if that's true, that would be quite the redemption arc. I am more than ready to see that. Although Clippy didn't really make a connection with its audience in a technologically useful sense, it certainly did in an emotional sense in the long term. Many of the people who once hated Clippy now love him, and in addition to his obnoxious aura just becoming pure meme material, a big reason for that is also nostalgia. There are now fully grown adults whose earliest memories are of seeing Clippy. For many people, he is the embodiment of the 1990s and early 2000s. And it takes them back to those warm and welcoming times, their childhood. But Clippy also lives on in our everyday lives. We could arguably attribute the excellent AI software that we use today to the failure of Clippy. It was a valuable lesson that taught us what not to do when creating virtual assistants. And that is certainly not a failure. So Clippy, don't be sad. You did one thing right, and you changed the world with it. Did you ever use Clippy? Did you like it? Hate it? Let me know your answers in the comments below.